In 1988, a discount chain with nearly 1,200 stores filed for bankruptcy. Most Americans barely noticed. That's the strange part. This wasn't some obscure regional operator. This was Zayre, the red and black sign that anchored strip malls from Maine to Florida, the store where a generation of baby boomers bought their first bicycle, their back-to-school clothes, their Christmas toys. At its peak, Zayre was one of the largest discount chains in America, built by a family of Russian immigrants who started out selling hosiery door-to-door. Then, in less than 2 years, it was gone. The name vanished from storefronts. The company that built it disappeared into paperwork. But here's what almost nobody realizes. Zayre never actually died. It just stopped calling itself Zayre and became something far bigger. The story of Zayre doesn't begin in 1956. It begins nearly 40 years earlier, in 1919, in a cramped corner of Chelsea, Massachusetts, where two brothers named Max and Morris Feldberg were trying to build a life out of almost nothing. They were Jewish immigrants who had fled Russia to escape conscription into the Tsar's army, part of a wave of families who arrived in Boston with little more than a trade and a willingness to work. Max and Morris started small, a wholesale business selling underwear and hosiery to department stores and specialty shops around New England. It wasn't glamorous. It was survival, but it taught them something that would matter decades later, how retail actually worked, from the supply side up. By 1929, the brothers had opened their own small chain of shops called Bell Hosiery, selling directly to customers instead of just supplying other stores. It grew slowly but steadily. By the end of World War II, there were about 30 Bell shops scattered across New England. Modest, respectable, forgettable. Then the next generation took over, and everything changed. Max's son Stanley and his cousin Sumner Feldberg had grown up inside the family business, and they were watching something happen in post-war America that their fathers hadn't fully grasped. Suburbs were exploding outward from every major city. Families wanted cars, driveways, backyards, and they wanted somewhere close to home to buy everything else, without paying department store prices. A new kind of retail was emerging around the country, the discount store. Self-service, no frills, low margins, high volume. Stanley and Sumner believed this was the future, and they wanted in. Their opportunity came in late 1955, when Stop and Shop approached them with a proposal. Build a discount store next to a new Stop and Shop supermarket, going up in Hyannis, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod. Instant foot traffic, a built-in customer base, and a location far enough from Boston that no one else had claimed the territory yet. On September 20th, 1956, the doors opened. It wasn't much to look at, just 5,000 square feet, a fraction of the size Zayre stores would eventually become. But walk through that door on opening day, and the difference from a traditional department store was immediate. There was no formality here, no glass counters with a clerk standing behind them, waiting to fetch your item. Merchandise sat out in the open, stacked on tables and shelves within arm's reach. Customers picked things up themselves, put them in a cart, and walked to a register. It felt faster. It felt like it belonged to the customer, not the store. The name itself came from Yiddish, a twist on the phrase "sehr gut," meaning very good. It was a promise, printed right there on the sign above the door. Within weeks, a second store opened in the Roslindale section of Boston, more than 7 times the size of the first. The Feldbergs weren't testing an idea anymore. They had already decided this was going to be big, and they were right. Within a few years, new Zayre stores would average 70,000 to 90,000 square feet, built to a formula that would carry the chain across the entire eastern United States. What started as a hosiery wholesaler run by two brothers escaping a war had become, in one generation, the beginning of a discount empire. But empires built fast have a way of outrunning the people meant to hold them together. And Zayre's real test was only beginning. By the mid-1960s, Zayre wasn't just growing. It was becoming part of the landscape. Drive along almost any major road in New England during those years, and sooner or later, a red and black sign would come into view. Zayre stretched across a low, wide building with a parking lot big enough to swallow a football field. New stores were opening at a pace of roughly 20 a year, first blanketing Massachusetts, then pushing into Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, before spreading further still into New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. For a family that had started out wholesaling hosiery in a cramped office in Chelsea, this was a transformation almost too large to comprehend. For the people who shopped there, Zayre wasn't an abstraction. It was Saturday mornings. It was the place where a mother could stretch a paycheck across school clothes, work boots, and a birthday present without setting foot anywhere else. Unlike the department stores in the city, there was no pressure, no dressing up, no clerk hovering nearby. You could walk the aisles, hold up a shirt against your kid to check the size, take your time. The stores felt enormous by the standards of the day, 70,000, sometimes 90,000 square feet. But the atmosphere was almost the opposite of intimidating. Wide, bright, self-service aisles. Toys stacked to the ceiling in the weeks before Christmas. A checkout line that, however long, moved with the particular rhythm of a place doing exactly what it was built to do. Ask anyone who grew up near a Zayre in the 1960s or 70s, and the memories tend to cluster around the same handful of moments. Back-to-school shopping in late August, when the aisles filled with notebooks, lunch boxes, and sneakers, and a kid's entire identity for the coming year seemed to hinge on which pair got picked. Birthdays, when a parent would hand over a few dollars and let a child wander the toy aisle alone for the first time, weighing a bicycle horn against a model airplane kit like it was the most important decision in the world. And Christmas, always Christmas, when the toy department became the closest thing a working-class family had to a wonderland, string lights overhead and shelves stacked with everything a catalog could promise, all of it actually within reach, sitting right there under fluorescent light instead of trapped up behind glass. This was the era when Zayre became a genuine competitor to Kmart, the two chains often opening stores within a few miles of each other, racing to claim the same suburban intersections before the other could get there. It was also the era when the Feldberg family, having proven the discount model could work at scale, started looking for what might come next. In 1962, the company went public on the New York Stock Exchange, giving it the capital to expand even faster. In 1969, it acquired Hit or Miss, a women's clothing chain, a small move at the time, but a sign that the family was thinking beyond a single format, beyond a single kind of store. Behind the counters and stockrooms, Zayre was also becoming one of the largest employers in dozens of small towns across the Northeast. For many of these communities, mill towns whose original industries were fading, small cities without much retail beyond a shrinking Main Street, a new Zayre store meant real jobs. Cashiers, stock clerks, department managers who started part-time in high school and stayed for a career. The store wasn't just a place to shop. It was often one of the largest buildings in town, one of the biggest employers, one of the few places where teenagers from across the community ended up working their very first job side by side. What was it about a store like this, loud, crowded, nothing fancy about it at all, that made it feel less like a business and more like a fixture of home? Maybe it was the reliability of it. In an era before big box superstores were everywhere, before anyone had heard the word supercenter, Zayre offered something that felt almost radical in its simplicity. Everything a family needed under one roof at a price that didn't require a special trip or a special occasion. You didn't save Zayre for holidays. You went on a random Tuesday because you needed socks. That ordinariness was the whole point, and it was precisely what made the store feel like it belonged to the people who shopped there rather than the other way around. By the mid-1970s, Zayre had crossed into rarefied territory, one of the largest discount retailers in the country, respected, profitable, deeply woven into the daily life of the Northeast. The Feldberg family had taken a hosiery wholesale business and in less than 2 decades built something that felt permanent. But permanence is a feeling, not a fact. Even as Zayre's stores kept multiplying across the map, a different kind of chain was quietly taking shape in Arkansas. One built around the same basic idea of low prices and self-service, but run with a discipline and a scale that Zayre's leadership had not yet begun to reckon with. The golden years were real. They were also, without anyone quite realizing it yet, already numbered. Growth, once it starts moving at a certain speed, has a way of concealing its own risks. Through the 1970s, Zayre's expansion machine ran at full throttle, and from the outside, everything about it looked like unstoppable success. The strategy was straightforward, and it had worked from the very beginning. Find a growing suburb, secure a location near a supermarket or a new shopping center, and build a store to the standard Zayre formula. 70,000 to 90,000 square feet, wide self-service aisles, a layout customers already recognized from the last town over. By the late 1970s, that formula had been repeated so many times that Zayre stores stretched across nearly the entire eastern half of the United States, from the coast of Maine down through the mid-Atlantic and into parts of the South. Trucks rolled out of the Framingham headquarters and distribution centers on a near-constant schedule, supplying stores that, to a shopper walking in blind, felt almost identical whether they were standing in a Zayre in Bangor or one in Baltimore. Unlike some of its competitors, Zayre didn't expand primarily through franchising. These were corporate-owned stores, built and staffed under the direct control of Zayre Corp. That had real advantages: tighter control over pricing, merchandise, and branding than a chain leaning on independent franchise owners. But it also meant every single new store was a direct financial commitment from the company itself. There was no franchisee absorbing the risk of a slow location. Every square foot of every new Zayre belonged, in every sense, to the parent company. For the small towns and expanding suburbs that received a new store, the arrival of Zayre was often treated as a genuine economic event. Local newspapers covered store openings. Town officials showed up for ribbon cuttings. And for the people who lived nearby, it meant something more immediate: jobs. A single Zayre location could employ dozens of people, from teenagers ringing up their first paychecks to career managers overseeing entire departments. In towns where the old mills and factories were already beginning to close, a Zayre store sometimes represented one of the last major employers left standing on Main Street. But growth at this pace came with a quieter cost, one that wouldn't become obvious for years. As Zayre added new stores by the dozens annually, maintaining consistency across hundreds of locations became a harder and harder problem to manage from a single headquarters. A store in a booming suburb might be freshly stocked, well-staffed, and thriving. A store in a town whose economy was already softening might struggle to get the same attention, the same inventory, the same investment in upkeep. From the outside, every red and black sign looked the same. On the inside, the experience was starting to quietly diverge. There was also a shift happening in where Americans were choosing to shop. Enclosed suburban malls were multiplying rapidly through the 1970s, anchored by department stores like Sears and J.C. Penney, drawing shoppers away from the strip mall when standalone locations that had defined Zayre's original growth model. Zayre, for the most part, stayed with what had built it: freestanding stores, often paired with a supermarket rather than mall-anchored locations. It was a decision rooted in the company's history and its lower price positioning. But it also meant Zayre was betting its future on a retail format that was no longer the only game in town. None of this stopped the expansion. If anything, the company doubled down. In 1969, the acquisition of the women's clothing chain. Hit or miss had already signaled the Feldberg family's appetite for growth beyond a single format. Through the 1970s, that appetite only grew. Zayre wasn't content being simply a discount department store chain anymore. It was becoming a holding company, a parent to multiple retail concepts operating under one roof of ownership, even as the flagship Zayre stores themselves kept multiplying across the map. By the end of the decade, the numbers alone were staggering for a company that had started with a single 5,000 square foot store on Cape Cod. Hundreds of locations, thousands of employees, a footprint that touched nearly every state east of the Mississippi. To anyone watching from the outside, Zayre looked less like a regional discounter and more like a permanent fixture of American retail, a company built to last. What almost no one watching could see yet was where the real center of gravity inside the company was quietly beginning to shift. The expansion machine that had built Zayre was about to collide with a new idea taking shape inside its own headquarters. One that, in time, would matter far more to the company's survival than any new store opening ever could. By the turn of the 1980s, Zayre had reached a scale that even the Feldberg family, sitting in that first 5,000 square foot store back in 1956, could hardly have imagined. Nearly 1,200 stores stretched across the eastern United States, from small Maine towns barely large enough to support a traffic light, to major metropolitan suburbs outside New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Zayre had become one of the largest discount chains in the country, standing shoulder to shoulder with Kmart in the fight for the same suburban customers. For millions of families across the Northeast in particular, Zayre wasn't just a place you shopped occasionally. It was woven into the rhythm of ordinary life. Grandparents who remembered the very first Hyannis store took their grown children there. Those children, in turn, brought their own kids down the same aisles a generation later. 3 generations of the same family, buying school shoes and birthday presents under the same red and black sign, in some cases at the exact same store that had stood on the same corner for 20 years. That kind of continuity is not something a company plans for in a boardroom. It happens slowly, town by town, without anyone announcing that it's happening. And by the early 1980s, it had happened to Zayre almost everywhere it operated. Inside the stores, the November to December stretch was the closest thing retail had to a season of its own. Toy aisles swelled to fill entire sections of the floor. Layaway counters, a lifeline for working families who couldn't pay for a bicycle or a winter coat all at once, saw their longest lines of the year, parents putting a few dollars down each week against a gift they were determined their kids would have on Christmas morning. For a family stretching every paycheck, that layaway ticket, tucked carefully in a kitchen drawer until it was paid off, represented something more than a transaction. It was a promise, made real one payment at a time. Employees who worked the floor during those years remember it as controlled chaos. Registers running nonstop, stockroom workers racing to keep shelves full, department managers who knew regular customers by name because they'd been ringing them up for a decade. For a lot of teenagers across the Northeast, a part-time job behind a Zayre register was their very first paycheck, their first taste of responsibility, sometimes their first real friendships outside of school. The store wasn't just where the community shopped. For thousands of people, it was where the community worked too. A civic fixture as much as a retailer, often among the largest employers in the smaller towns it operated in. Zayre had also quietly become something bigger than a single chain. Behind the scenes, the company that owned it was assembling a small empire of retail concepts, the hit or miss clothing stores, and by the late 1970s, a fast-growing off-price experiment called TJ Maxx, which had opened its first location in Framingham in 1977. Few customers walking into a Zayre store to buy socks and school supplies had any idea that the same corporate parent was quietly building something else entirely under a different name in a different part of the market. At the time, it seemed like a minor side project. Nobody inside the company yet understood how much that would matter. What was it exactly that made a store this ordinary? Fluorescent lights, concrete floors, no glamour to speak of. Feel like something worth passing down from one generation to the next? Perhaps it was never really about the merchandise at all. It was about reliability in a country that was changing fast around these families. Deindustrialization creeping into mill towns, paychecks stretching thinner, uncertainty settling into communities that had once felt secure. Zayre didn't promise luxury. It promised that no matter what else was happening, you could walk through those doors on a Tuesday afternoon and walk out with what your family needed at a price you could actually afford. In an era of growing economic anxiety, that kind of dependability was its own form of comfort, and for a while it seemed like nothing could take it away. But comfort built on dependability has a hidden vulnerability. It only works as long as the company delivering it stays focused on the promise that built it in the first place. And inside Zayre's own headquarters, attention was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to drift somewhere else. In the early 1980s, if you had asked a loyal Zayre shopper Whether anything was wrong, most would have said no. The stores were still full. The layaway counters still had lines at Christmas. From the sales floor, everything looked exactly like it always had. But a few miles away in Bentonville, Arkansas, a company most East Coast shoppers had barely heard of was expanding at a pace that would soon change the entire discount retail industry. And Zayre's leadership was not moving fast enough to notice. Walmart's approach was different in ways that seemed small individually, but added up to something enormous. Aggressive investment in distribution and logistics kept costs down in ways older discounters hadn't matched. Newer stores, built with a more modern, efficient layout, made older chains start to look tired by comparison. And a relentless focus on rock-bottom pricing, backed by a supply chain built specifically for that purpose, put pressure on every regional discounter east of the Mississippi, Zayre very much included. By the mid-1980s, Walmart wasn't just a competitor anymore. It was rewriting the rules of the entire discount category. Zayre wasn't the only one feeling it. Kmart, Ames, Bradley's, nearly every chain built on the same 1960s-era discount model was starting to face the same uncomfortable questions about whether their stores, their systems, and their cost structures could keep up with what Walmart was building. But Zayre had a problem that was, in some ways, more particular to itself. Many of its stores, especially the older locations built in the 1960s and early 70s, hadn't been meaningfully renovated in years. Fixtures were dated. Buildings that had once felt modern and spacious now looked cramped and worn next to the newer, brighter stores opening around them. Customers who had shopped at Zayre their entire lives started to notice. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulating small ways that erode a brand's reputation over time. The stores that had once felt like the future of shopping were starting to feel like the past. There was also a subtler problem, one that didn't show up on any balance sheet right away. Inside Zayre Corp's Framingham headquarters, a different business was quietly outperforming everything else in the company's portfolio. TJ Maxx, the off-price clothing concept the company had launched almost as an experiment back in 1977, was growing fast and generating strong returns, selling name-brand merchandise at deep discounts, with a treasure hunt shopping experience that felt fresh in a way the traditional discount department store no longer did. For executives watching the numbers come in every quarter, the contrast was becoming harder to ignore. One division was carrying the weight of an aging format and shrinking margins. The other was the future. A longtime Zayre store manager in one Massachusetts location later recalled the shift in priorities as something you could feel on the ground before anyone said it out loud. Budget requests for basic maintenance, new flooring, updated signage, repairs that had been routine in years past, started coming back approved more slowly or not at all. Corporate visits, once frequent, became rarer. It wasn't that anyone announced Zayre was being deprioritized. It was quieter than that. Resources simply seemed to be flowing somewhere else, and the people running the stores day to day were left to make do with less. Did anyone inside Zayre Corp's leadership see clearly, in those years, what direction the company was actually heading? Some likely did. Retail executives are not blind to which of their divisions is thriving and which is struggling. That much is visible in any quarterly report. What's harder to know is whether, in the early to mid-1980s, anyone at the top fully grasped how permanent that divergence was becoming, or whether it still looked like a temporary rough patch that better management could fix. Corporate statements from the period stayed focused on modernization efforts and competitive repositioning, the standard language of a company insisting, publicly, that it had a plan. For the shoppers walking those aisles, none of this internal maneuvering was visible yet. The stores were still open. The layaway counters were still busy in November. Life at the customer level continued much as it always had. But underneath that surface of normalcy, the foundation Zayre had been built on, corporate belief, corporate investment, corporate attention, was beginning, slowly and almost invisibly, to shift its weight towards something else entirely. The cracks were still hairline. Nobody buying school shoes on a Saturday afternoon in 1984 would have called it a crisis. But cracks, once they start, rarely stay hairline for long. By the mid-1980s, the divergence inside Zayre Corp was no longer a subtle shift in budget approvals. It was becoming a deliberate, strategic choice, and the people making that choice were doing so with a clarity that the shoppers walking Zayre's aisles could not have imagined. Inside the company's Framingham headquarters, the numbers told an increasingly stark story. The traditional Zayre discount stores, the ones the entire company had been built around since 1956, were generating thin margins in an industry being reshaped by Walmart's relentless efficiency. Meanwhile, TJ Maxx, the off-price concept that had started almost as a side experiment less than a decade earlier, was posting the kind of growth and profitability that made it impossible for executives to ignore. Every dollar of capital investment had to be weighed against where it would generate the best return. And increasingly, that answer wasn't the flagship discount stores anymore. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into nostalgic memories of Zayre, because it happened entirely out of view of the customers who loved the stores. Decisions about capital allocation, about which divisions received investment and which didn't, were made in boardrooms, not on sales floors. And through the mid-1980s, those decisions consistently tilted in one direction. Corporate resources that might once have gone toward renovating aging Zayre locations, updating store layouts, or investing in better inventory systems increasingly flowed instead toward expanding TJ Maxx and the company's other growing off-price ventures. For the people running individual Zayre stores, the district managers, the department heads, the longtime employees who had built careers inside the company, this played out as a slow, frustrating erosion of support. Store managers who had once been able to get approval for basic repairs found themselves making do with buildings that were visibly aging. Employees who had spent 15, 20 years with the company began to sense, even without being told directly, that Zayre itself was no longer where the company's ambitions lived. One former district-level employee later described it as watching a parent's attention shift entirely to a favored younger sibling. The older stores kept running, kept staffed, kept technically alive, but no longer nurtured the way they once had been. There is no evidence that Zayre Corporation's leadership acted with any intention to deceive the public or harm employees. This was, by most accounts, a rational business response to a changing marketplace, a company recognizing that one part of its business could no longer compete on the terms the industry now demanded, while another part was thriving under a completely different model. But rational as it may have looked from a spreadsheet, the human cost of that choice was real, and it landed on people who had no say in how the decision was made. By 1987, the direction had become impossible to disguise, even to outsiders. That year, Zayre Corporation formally reorganized, creating a new parent entity called the TJX Companies, Inc., a structure explicitly built around the off-price businesses, with TJ Maxx and Hit or Miss positioned as the future of the company. The traditional Zayre discount stores, once the entire reason the company existed, were now just one division inside a larger holding company whose center of gravity had clearly moved elsewhere. For longtime Zayre employees, this corporate restructuring landed as confirmation of what many had already suspected on the ground. The stores where they'd built careers were no longer the company's core identity. They were, in the language of corporate strategy, a legacy division, a phrase that carries a particular kind of quiet finality for the people who work inside it. What happened next unfolded with a speed that stunned even some of the people closest to it. In 1988, facing continued pressure from Walmart and other competitors, and no longer positioned as the strategic priority within its own parent company, Zayre Corp. Filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. For a chain that had operated for over 3 decades, employed tens of thousands of people, and anchored shopping centers across the entire eastern United States, the filing marked the beginning of the end. Not a slow fade, but a rapid, formal unwinding. Within months, the company reached an agreement to sell the entire Zayre store network to a competing chain, Ames Department Stores. The deal, finalized in October 1988, meant that hundreds of Zayre locations would either close outright or be converted, store by store, into Ames stores. The signage changed, the layout altered, the name that generations of families had grown up with simply erased from the building. For the employees inside those stores, the news arrived the way corporate news often does, through a memo, a meeting, a phone call from a district office, sometimes with only weeks of warning before the changes began. Cashiers who had worked the same register for a decade found themselves either reapplying for their own jobs under a new company or unemployed altogether. Store managers who had spent their careers inside the Zayre system now had to decide whether to stay on under Ames's ownership or start over somewhere else entirely. Was there a single moment when the people running Zayre Corp now understood that the discount chain they'd built their family's name around was no longer going to survive? If there was, it likely came sometime in that same period, when the bankruptcy filing turned a years-long strategic drift into an irreversible legal reality. What had been, for nearly a decade, a quiet redirection of resources and attention was now suddenly an ending with a date attached to it. The stores that remained open kept their lights on and their registers running for a little while longer. But the company that had built them no longer believed in their future, and soon neither would anyone else. The bankruptcy filing in 1988 was not the end of Zayre. It was the beginning of a very public, very fast unraveling, one that played out in store windows, local newspapers, and the quiet conversations of employees who had spent years, sometimes decades, inside a company that suddenly no longer had a clear future. Once the agreement to sell the Zayre store network to Ames department stores was finalized in October 1988, the transformation began almost immediately. Store by store, the process unfolded with a strange, methodical calm. The kind of calm that comes from a decision already made, rather than one still being debated. Crews arrived to take down the red and black Zayre signage that had marked these buildings for 20, sometimes 30 years, replacing it with Ames's blue and white branding. Inside, merchandise displays were reorganized to match Ames's layout standards. Price tags were reprinted. In some locations, the conversion happened almost overnight. In others, it stretched out over weeks, with the store operating under a strange, in-between identity. No longer fully Zayre, not yet fully Ames. For customers who had shopped at a particular Zayre store their entire lives, the change often arrived without warning, beyond a sign in the window announcing the transition. Some welcomed it as simple continuity. The store stayed open, the aisles were still there, life went on. Others felt something closer to a quiet loss, even if it was hard to articulate exactly what had gone missing. It wasn't that the merchandise had changed dramatically. It was that a name that had meant something specific. Saturday mornings, back-to-school trips, the particular smell of a store that hadn't been renovated in a decade, was simply gone, replaced by a name that carried none of that history for the people walking in. For employees, the experience was far more immediate and far more consequential. At store after store, workers who had built entire careers inside the Zayre system were told, sometimes with only a few weeks' notice, that their store would be converting to Ames, and that their jobs, their positions, their years of accumulated seniority were not guaranteed to carry over. Some employees were offered positions under the new ownership, often at different terms than what they'd had before. Others were simply let go, their roles eliminated as Ames restructured the stores to fit its own operational model. For longtime department managers and cashiers alike, the sense of dislocation was profound. Not because the building had changed hands, but because an identity they had spent years building, both personally and professionally, had been erased almost overnight. Locations that didn't convert to Ames faced an even more abrupt ending. In towns where Ames already had a nearby store, or where a Zayre location didn't fit the acquiring company's plans, the doors simply closed. Liquidation sales moved through these stores with brutal efficiency. Shelves picked clean of remaining inventory, fixtures sold off, signage removed, the building left empty. For the towns that depended on these stores as major employers, the closure meant more than an inconvenience. It meant a hole in the local economy that in some smaller communities took years to fill. Local newspapers across New England and the Mid-Atlantic covered the transitions with a mixture of practical reporting and quiet nostalgia. Stories ran about the history of the original Hyannis store, about the Feldberg family's decades-long build of the chain, about what the closures meant for towns that had grown up around a Zayre parking lot. But there was no single dramatic final day that captured national attention. No crowds gathering for one last purchase, no widely photographed closing ceremony. The end of Zayre happened the way so much of American retail history happens. Store by store, town by town, with far less ceremony than the scale of the loss actually deserved. By 1990, the transformation was complete. Every Zayre location that had survived the bankruptcy and sale was now operating under the Ames name, or had closed permanently. The red and black signs that had once stretched from Cape Cod to the mid-Atlantic no longer existed anywhere. A company that, just 2 years earlier, had operated nearly 1,200 stores and employed tens of thousands of people had, in the span of about 18 months, ceased to exist as a retail operation entirely. But the story of Zayre Corp itself didn't end there, because the company hadn't disappeared. It had simply completed the transformation that had begun quietly years earlier, inside those same boardrooms where resources had steadily shifted away from the discount stores and toward the off-price concepts the company believed in more. In June 1989, Zayre Corp formally merged with its own subsidiary, the TJ Companies Inc. The entity created 2 years earlier to house TJ Maxx, Hit or Miss, and the company's other off-price ventures. What had once been Zayre Corporation, the parent of hundreds of discount department stores, now existed purely as TJX, a company built entirely around the off-price model that had quietly been outperforming the traditional stores for years. For the employees who had lost their jobs during the Ames conversion, and for the customers who had watched their neighborhood Zayre disappear, this corporate footnote likely meant very little at the time. The company they'd known was gone. Whatever legal entity existed on paper somewhere in Framingham didn't change the fact that a store that had been part of their lives for decades no longer had a physical presence in their town. And Ames, the company that had absorbed most of Zayre's stores, would not prove to be the stable new home many hoped it might be. Ames itself was already carrying significant debt from its own aggressive growth strategy through the 1980s, and the sudden addition of hundreds of former Zayre locations, some in markets Ames didn't fully understand, some in buildings that needed investment Ames couldn't easily provide, added new strain to an already fragile company. Within just a few years, Ames would file for its own bankruptcy, a first time in 1990 and a final fatal filing in 2001 that closed the company permanently. For many former Zayre employees who had transitioned to Ames hoping for stability, the ground would shift beneath them yet again. What made the collapse of Zayre different from other retail failures of the era wasn't the speed of it, or even the scale. Plenty of chains disappeared just as quickly during this period of discount retail consolidation. What made it different was the strange duality at its core. This was, in every meaningful sense to the people who worked there and shopped there, a genuine collapse, a beloved, decades-old chain wiped from the map, its employees scattered, its buildings rebranded or shuttered. And yet, at the exact same moment, in the exact same corporate offices, something else was being born. The company wasn't dying. It was shedding a version of itself that no longer fit where American retail was headed. And the entity that emerged from that shedding would go on to become one of the most successful retailers in the country. None of that would have offered much comfort to a cashier standing in an empty Zayre store in 1989, watching the fixtures get carried out the door. For the people who lived through it, this was simply an ending. The loss of a job, a routine, a place that had mattered. The bigger story, the one about transformation and survival, would only become visible with the passage of time. In the years immediately after 1990, the physical evidence of Zayre's existence didn't disappear all at once. Former Zayre buildings dotted the landscape across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, most of them wearing Ames signage now. Though longtime residents in dozens of towns kept calling the building the Old Zayre for years, sometimes decades, after the name had officially changed. That kind of linguistic stubbornness says something real about how deeply the store had rooted itself into local memory. A brand can vanish from a sign and still live on in how people give each other directions. For the towns whose Ames stores also eventually failed, The fate of the old Zayre building often became a second, quieter story. Some were subdivided into smaller retail spaces. Some sat vacant for years, hollow shells at the edge of a shopping plaza, a familiar landmark slowly turning into a symbol of decline for the whole area. Others were eventually demolished and rebuilt as something else entirely. A grocery store, a home improvement chain, in some cases a self-storage facility. The ultimate irony for a building that once existed to sell people things to fill their homes with. For the employees who lost their positions during the Ames transition, the paths forward varied enormously. Some found work at competing retailers and simply carried their retail careers elsewhere. Others, particularly longtime managers who had built specialized skills inside Zayre's specific systems, struggled to translate decades of institutional knowledge into a job market that had already moved on. There is no single, tidy narrative here. No clean statistic capturing what happened to the tens of thousands of people whose working lives had been organized around a company that no longer existed. What's documented instead is scattered. Local news stories about longtime store managers starting over in their 50s, families who had depended on Zayre wages for 2 generations suddenly needing a new plan. The real second act, though, belonged not to the stores, but to the company that had once owned them. The TJX companies, freed entirely from the weight of the aging discount format, poured its full attention into the off-price model that had already proven itself years earlier. TJ Maxx expanded aggressively through the 1990s. Marshall's, another off-price chain, was acquired in 1995. Home Goods followed in 1992, what had started as a side experiment inside Zayre Corp. Back in 1977 became the entire identity of a company that, decades later, would rank among the largest and most profitable retailers in the United States. A fate that the traditional Zayre stores, competing directly against Walmart on price alone, almost certainly could not have matched. There is a genuine lesson in that divergence for anyone studying American retail history. Zayre's collapse wasn't really a story about a company failing to understand its customers or losing touch with what people wanted. The stores were still busy, the layaway counters still full, right up until the end. It was a story about a company recognizing correctly that one part of its business had a ceiling that another part didn't, and making the difficult, unsentimental choice to bet everything on the part with a future. That choice devastated the employees and communities tied to the discount stores. It also, unambiguously, saved the company itself from disappearing entirely, the way so many of its 1980s-era competitors eventually would. Ames, the company that inherited most of Zayre's physical stores, offers the counterpoint to that lesson. Weighed down by debt and the strain of absorbing hundreds of new locations it didn't fully have the resources to support, Ames filed for bankruptcy in 1990, reorganized, and struggled on for another decade before filing again in 2001, a filing from which it never recovered. By 2002, Ames itself was gone, and with it, the last physical traces of what had once been the Zayre store network largely disappeared from American retail entirely. So what does it actually mean when a name disappears from every storefront in the country, while the company behind it goes on to thrive under a different one? It suggests that the story we tell about corporate death and corporate life doesn't always match the reality underneath it. From the perspective of a family that shopped at Zayre for 20 years, or an employee who lost a job during the Ames conversion, the ending was real, complete, and permanent. From the perspective of a shareholder holding stock in Zayre Corp through 1989, nothing was lost at all. It simply changed shape. Both of those experiences are true at the same time, and neither cancels the other out. That tension between the human loss of a beloved store and the corporate logic that made its disappearance almost inevitable is in many ways the real inheritance Zayre left behind. Picture a Saturday afternoon sometime in 1975. The parking lot outside is full, cars angled in every direction, and through the glass doors the store hums with the particular noise of a place doing exactly what it was built to do. Carts rattling over concrete floors, a register bell ringing somewhere near the front, a kid 3 aisles over begging for something just out of reach of the family budget. The lights overhead are fluorescent and unglamorous. The aisles are wide and a little crowded. Somewhere near the back, a mother is counting out crumpled bills at the layaway counter, making a payment on a coat that will be ready in full by the time the weather turns cold enough to need it. None of this looked like history in the making. It looked like an ordinary Tuesday that happened to fall on a Saturday. That was the entire point. It is worth remembering that Zayre was never trying to be extraordinary. It was trying to be dependable, and for over 3 decades across nearly 1,200 stores, stretching from a small cape in Massachusetts down through the mid-Atlantic, it succeeded at exactly that. What made the store matter wasn't any single product on its shelves. It was what those shelves represented to the families who filled their carts from them. The ability to walk in with a modest paycheck and walk out having covered what the week required, without ceremony, without a special occasion, without needing to feel like you'd earned the right to be there. A store like that becomes part of a community's bloodstream in a way that has very little to do with retail strategy. It becomes part of how people remember their own childhoods. For the small towns across New England and the Northeast that grew up alongside Zayre, the store was never just a place to shop. It was one of the largest employers on the block, sometimes in the whole town. The first paycheck for a generation of teenagers, the workplace where neighbors became coworkers and coworkers became the kind of friends who stay in touch for decades after the uniform came off. It was the layaway ticket tucked into a kitchen drawer, paid off one careful installment at a time until a Christmas morning bicycle became real. It was 3 generations of the same family, walking the same aisles a decade apart, each one certain, in their own time, that this was simply how shopping worked in America. None of that disappeared because a company made a difficult strategic choice in a boardroom 400 miles away. What Zayre built in the people who shopped there and worked there was never really contingent on the company's survival. It lived in habits, in Saturday routines, in the particular comfort of a store that never asked you to be anyone other than who you were. That kind of belonging doesn't get erased by a change of signage. It gets carried forward quietly in the people who were there. The Feldberg family, who started with nothing more than a hosiery wholesale business run by 2 brothers who had fled a war, built something that mattered to more people than they likely ever fully understood. They also, when the moment demanded it, made the harder choice, letting go of the very thing that had built their name in the first place, so that something else they had created could survive and grow. That is not a betrayal of what Zayre once was. It is, in its own unsentimental way, a kind of honesty about what businesses have to do to endure, even when enduring means leaving something loved behind. Somewhere today in a strip mall that has been rebuilt 2 or 3 times over since 1988, there is a TJ Maxx or a Marshall's standing on a plot of land that was once for a few decades a Zayre. Almost none of the people wheeling their carts through it now would recognize the connection, but it is there, in the ground beneath their feet, in the company that owns the register they're standing at. A quiet, unbroken thread running all the way back to a 5,000 square foot store in Hyannis, Massachusetts, and 2 brothers who once sold hosiery door to door. The name is gone. The buildings mostly are gone or unrecognizable. But something of what Zayre was, the promise of a place where an ordinary family could walk in and be taken care of, never really left. It just kept going, quietly, under a different name, the way the best parts of the past so often do.